Thank you. So just to refresh us, I'll go back and read the two woes that we're going to cover. So Habakkuk 2, verse 15. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk. In order to gaze at their nakedness, you will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes his speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, arise, awake, and to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So we talked a little bit about that fourth woe last time. We just kind of barely touched on it. There kind of is a couple of schools of thought. I'll let you know last time that I think this could be actually directly talking about the Babylonians, their usage of alcohol as a means by which to intoxicate people. And I think that Daniel chapter 5, the great party that Belshazzar throws, kind of indicates that. But there's another school of thought that says that this intoxication being described here is kind of the sweeping through these nations and taking over these peoples, and then making assertions and promises as a way to kind of soften the blow of captivity. And I actually think there's some evidence, I think, of that as well. I kind of thought about Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, verses 5 to 7. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of the time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So just this idea that you come here, you get the best education, you get the best of the king's everything, as a way to maybe ingratiate themselves with the people of Judah, maybe make them think that what is happening now is better than what was happening before, maybe trying to pull the wool over their eyes in a way. I don't necessarily hold fast to either of them as being absolutely definitive. I think the general principle is that the Babylonians used kind of a by any means necessary approach to do what they wanted to do. Of course, those are already things we've discussed in the previous woes, talking about subjugation of people and using backbreaking labor to build their kingdom. So it kind of stands to reason that they would do other things to carry out their plans, alcohol being one of those things. I found some research that said that there was a general sort of attitude towards things like alcohol and other intoxicants in Babylon that was kind of like if you have a desire, we have something available for you, which is not unlike the United States in a lot of ways, I think. The point being that I think for us, we should be very mindful of the way we deal with our brothers and sisters. Obviously, we know the New Testament talks about not putting stumbling blocks in front of one another, being mindful of our brothers and sisters, what they struggle with, being mindful of our influence over people. We all have levels of influence over people that we can exploit. We can, I think Trish used the phrase, step on people's neck to get what we want. I think that's a great way to put it. We have to be mindful of things like that. Just being mindful of the way we behave and act, and how that can be interpreted, how that can be manipulated and used for evil, of course. But the larger point in the fourth woe comes obviously in the latter half of 16, when he says, the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The Jeremiah 25 passage is basically kind of where this is drawing from, saying that what you've done to other people, God's going to bring that cup of destruction back around to you. So you make me drink your cup of destruction. and God's going to make you drink equally so. And we see that in short order. Babylon's gone, and history moves forward, and they're no longer a power in that way. So, yeah, that last question: is there anything in that y'all have kind of drawn from this fourth woe in thinking about it in practical terms? Just this idea of not using intoxicants, not using our influence for evil, things like that. Any comments or questions or observations? Aaron.
Just the general observation that history tends to work in circles, history tends to repeat itself, and in this case, you can look at the conquest of the New World and the role that alcohol played in pacifying the population that was being displaced, the population that was being attacked at the time, and how we have essentially traveled that same path that Babylon traveled, the same path that Rome traveled, because in Revelation it talks about, the using alcohol and other things like that as a way to intoxicate the nations. So there's this, I think there is both a real aspect to it and a metaphorical aspect to it, where it is talking about the fact that it's a way that nations, conquering nations, have used to pacify populations, but it is also just the general lack of control and self-control that these nations would promote as means of essentially pacifying the populations, as a means of keeping them from looking at the state of their lives and realizing what kind of state they were in.
Yeah. And I certainly won't belabor the idea that we've, as a nation ourselves, have certainly exported a lot of evil to the world. Certainly we're importers of that evil as well, but we've, I think, acted equally as treacherous at times, for sure. Yes, sir.
I think it's also important for us to remember that they didn't have water purification systems back then like they do today. They didn't have all these different kinds of things that a person could drink. So wine, milk, beer, some of those things were pretty common in those days to drink. So this is an interesting text because it makes you step back and look, well, what do you do? I think it's all about self-control.
Yeah, absolutely. For time's sake, we'll go ahead and just move on to the fifth woe. Okay. And I'll read that again, verse 18. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake. To a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So I hope I think there's sort of a crescendo effect of the way that God's laid out these woes to the Chaldeans. I think the way that he kind of starts with, first what you go and do is you take things that I've never given you, I've never ordained for you to go and take. And then on top of that, once you've taken these things from these people, you build up these towers, you build up these battlements, these sort of structures as a shrine to yourself. And we saw Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4 say, look at this amazing stuff that I built. All the while, in the third woe, not recognizing that certainly God allowed you to be in this position, as we saw in Habakkuk 1. God allowed you to be in this position, but also you subjected people to harsh rule. You subjected people to slavery, and that's also the reason why you're able to build up these amazing things by all standards. That culminates into a nation that's willing to do all of these other things is the nation that is idolatrous. And of course, we know that the fundamental reason that these conversations between Habakkuk and God are happening is because Judah was so idolatrous. They had fallen down that path themselves. So this sort of final woe, I think, serves as, yes, obviously a condemnation of Babylon, but a reminder to Judah that this is why this is about to happen to you. That's at least what I think. If there's any behavior or activity that's more like roundly condemned in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, than idolatry, I don't necessarily know what it would be, but I mean the scriptural I don't know what you call it. The scripture is replete with examples of God condemning idolatry. Jeremiah 50:38 talking about Babylon. For it's the land of images, they're mad over idols. Psalm 135, the idol of the nations are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, nor is there breath inside their mouths. Those who make them will be like them, and so all who trust in them. I particularly like that, the 135, for the way it's a good reminder of what you're lacking in when you pursue an idol, in whatever form that takes, be it an image, structure, or some other idol you've lofted up in your heart. What's being said here is God hears you. God speaks to you. God sees you. But this thing you're pursuing, this thing cannot do any of those things. It's inanimate. It has no capability to act on your behalf. It has no capability to answer your prayers. It's completely futile to pursue it. And again, these are just some amazing verses also talking about idolatry. Jonah 2:8, those who pray regard the vain idols, forsake their hope of a steadfast love. Judges 10:14, go and cry out to the gods whom you've chosen. Let them save you in the time of your distress. Isaiah 41, behold, you're nothing, and your work is less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you. In Isaiah 44, all who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know, that they may be put to shame. So I think the futility of pursuing after idols, it kind of fundamentally boils down to you're seeking after something that can never possibly be supplied to you. And also it's your own hands that are preparing it. You're attempting to make a godlike image with a godlike purpose by human hands that are fragile, human hands that are tempted, human hands that are dirty and sullied. And you're trying to make something that's perfect and pure and righteous. And there's great ignorance in that. There's tremendous disrespect. It's the height of arrogance, as God obviously lays out here. And I think it's the reason why he finishes out the woes in this way. So are there any thoughts about that, about idolatry, about why God chose this last woe? Janet?
I think I struggled when I was younger to make a present day application for myself to idols because today it doesn't look the same as it's described in the Old Testament, but I think the principle is still very much there. That it's when you're putting your trust and your hope and your faith in something other than God. And I think it speaks to the overall nature of man, that I think this was so prominent in the Old Testament, especially because it speaks to human nature to look to something higher than ourselves that is in control. And then out of that ignorance, creating other things other than God to put that trust in. Yeah. But it's still so applicable today, even if we're not worshiping statues and, things like that. What do we tend to put our trust and faith in other than God? Are we relying on a bank account? Are we relying on our job? Are we putting all of our hope and trust in something other than God? That's when it becomes an idol, something that we're relying on other than God. And previously being a science teacher, I think of knowledge and science being one of those things too for people that my frustration in the science realm was that science by definition is like our human understanding of the way the world works, basically, and the way life and nature work. It's our human understanding. And I used to find it comical that scientists, that people in the science realm would scoff at the notion of a God and think their own understanding of what he created was somehow superior to that. So that's where my mind goes. Is I think some of the most common idols today: knowledge, science, money.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Did we have other comments? Trish?
When I read these verses, I see God with his tongue in his cheek.
Yeah.
He's making them look so ridiculous, and the fallacy of their logic is so obvious that he's just, I think it shows his sense of humor that you would put these idols of wood, of gold, of rock ahead of somebody that can really do things for you and talk to you and save you. And I just take it as kind of comical that, and they're not going to get it.
Right.
That's for us to glean from, because it took captivity and torture and misery for them to learn their lesson.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
So one of the uses of those idols was a very economic interest,
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes that's certainly where we can get caught. So some of the temples were actually banks that if you would go and give to the goddess or the god, then you could come back next year with, take that money back out with interest, and then if you went and prayed for something, well, then the priests could loan you some money and you could engage in enterprise. And so propping up these idols could also, in those days, and there's evidence of that, would prop up a very significant economic interest. And so to engage, it could kind of look like, oh, I was blessed, by the God, and me being a portion of this faith is helping me economically. And I definitely think it's interesting that our money has faces on it, and certainly there are some jobs that rely heavily on fundraising, and it's important to make sure that we always keep our mind on who is actually providing the benefit. Because in Habakkuk, 18:18, what profit is an idol? Well, from an economic sense, there was some profit, but what real profit, is the idol from the real things that matter? And the God who made the ear and the God who made the eye, doesn't he actually see? And doesn't he actually hear? And so I think it's important to always keep that in mind when sometimes some of the benefits we could link to those things.
Yeah. I like the mention of that, the temple that was a bank, or bank that was a temple. There's we certainly think along these lines too, the security of things like that, of financial institutions and stuff like that. But it's funny, it's like you're banking things here that as a way to stave off destruction or whatever, and God's still declaring, I don't care. The cup of destruction will still come to you. You're still going to be punished for this unbelief. Aaron.
In order of importance, in the first 3 commandments that God gives to the Israelites, the first one is, do not have other gods besides me.
Yeah.
And so God wants to be first. There's so much about God being first. It's
Right.
Seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. There's this idea of looking to God first, not letting other things get in the way of our pursuit of God.
Yes.
Including the next one, which is, do not make an idol for yourself. So there's this, don't create other gods. Don't create other gods with human understanding. But then the next one is equally important. We often say, don't use the name of the Lord in vain, and we talk about swearing. But I like the Holman Christian Standards version of it, which says, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. How many people are there on this planet who currently call out to a singular God, but they're misusing his name because they're attaching it to things that God never authorized. They're attaching it to things that God doesn't want. They're attaching it to ideas that God doesn't have.
Yep.
They're misusing the name of God in order to justify the things that they want to do.
Yeah.
So it's not just don't follow money. It's not just don't create an image of wood, but it's also let's not create an idea of God that's false and follow that.
Yep. No, absolutely. Like,
Yeah, I can't think of this without going to Hebrews 11:1, where you're talking about the difference between faith and trust.
right.
You know, if you look at all the major religions of the world today, all of them have some kind of idol that's associated with them because they trust something they can see
Right.
versus having a faith as something they can't see. And I think that's a great thing to look at for me personally, because I can look at Hebrews 11:1 and recognize it's more about the faith I have versus being able to touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. I've got just a few applications, the futility of seeking after idols, seeking after spiritual validation apart from God. God pays attention to our behavior. He pays attention to the way we as individuals act towards those we're around. He pays attention to the nations. He pays attention to the way that they conduct, affairs of state, conduct, I think, politics, things of that nature. And a part of that is, he's angered by exploitation of vulnerable people. We read in Leviticus 19 about, I think Aaron had said, the weightier matters of the Old Testament, about treating immigrants and people that are strangers in your land correctly. And I think obviously the Chaldeans certainly weren't doing that. In Judah at the time, it seems like they were also falling guilty of that. Righteous live by faith. That's obviously the primary theme of the book, the primary theme of chapter 2. God's going to humble the haughty and arrogant. He warns of vices that can be used to shame and exploit, and being aware of that and guarding your hearts in that way. And then, of course, he ends with pretty much declaring that I hate idolatry, and because of that, you're going to be condemned. Okay. So, in terms of how to orient ourselves, because I know not everybody has been able to be here for the whole class, chapter 1 started with the laments. God, we feel hemmed in. The righteous feel hemmed in by the immorality that is abounding in Judah right now. Where are you? Why are you idle? Why are you not solving the problems that we see? Where are you? And God responds by saying, I'm actually here. I'm doing a work that you're going to find hard to understand. It's going to confound you. I'm building up a nation over here, a nation that is wicked, a nation that, as we just saw in chapter 2, reads like the worst character out of any movie you can possibly imagine, like the ultimate level of evil. I'm using them to actually do something good in your day, bring about a sort of righteous response. And so then Habakkuk he sort of ends chapter 1 by saying, I don't know if that's what I meant. That's not really what I was going after. You're too good of a God to see wickedness and just be okay with it. I think he was still thinking about that God's just okay with this wickedness happening. But then he begins chapter 2 by saying, as an ultimate act of faith, I'm going to wait for you to show more to me, explain more to me over what's about to happen. And of course, God reveals the woes. He says, this is where Babylon stands condemned. And because this is what they're doing, I'm going to judge them accordingly. I'm going to destroy them in short order. And so that's where we find ourselves when we get to chapter 3. So I'm going to read chapter 3 for us. Prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to the Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you. In your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hand on high. The sun and moon stood in their place. At the light of your arrows they sped. At the flashing of your glittering spear, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me. Rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon those who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. The choir master with stringed instruments. So I hope you can kind of see the way that faith is now moved in this book, going from having doubts of God, questioning of God, consternation, severe confusion, doubts, all of those things, to let me wait and have God answer, let him reveal information to me, let him reveal his will to me, to now let me spend this time and praise God. Let me spend this time and think on things that God has done for us, think on things that God will do for us. So the tone of this book really has kind of changed completely, and this is a really beautiful way to end the book. And I'm glad this is obviously the last class, because this is just an amazing passage right here. Verses 1 and 2 to me kind of mirrors how we started chapter 2, when he says, "O Lord, I've heard the report of you. In your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. Wrath, remember mercy." I think Habakkuk wants to hasten the things that God's declared are going to happen. I think he wants the captivity and all those things to occur quickly, so that the greater plans of God can come about, that sort of, from the ashes of the past, something new can be brought out. I think he's sort of pining after that. I think he wants that to happen. Interestingly, I still find a lot of humanity in this, because he says in verse 2, "In wrath, remember mercy." It's really funny, because it's funny to me that a human would tell God what he needs to remember. Kind of similar to how Habakkuk in chapter 1 had said, "You're too good to see evil and be okay with it," as though God doesn't know what he's fully capable of being and what he is. But I think it's just a very human moment. Habakkuk wants to be able to cling to something with confidence, and I think he knows the true nature of God. I think he's exhibited it and obviously talked about it here. I just found that really interesting. I don't know why that always stood out to me, but it's just funny to say, God, just remember a couple of things, you know? Of course, God, we know, will remember mercy. He will remember his people. I liked this David Firth quote you'll see on the board. This psalm helps the community work out what faith looks like as it waits, and why they can be confident that Yahweh will triumph. For time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and just move into kind of the meat of the passage. Basically, verses 3 through 15, if I were to kind of describe it to someone, is probably the easiest way you can get a pretty decent grasp of the history of God with his nation, with Israel. And if anybody wants access to these slides or anything like that, just let me know. I doubt we're going to be able to cover all of this material, unfortunately, but I'll try to hit a lot of the high points. You can kind of see them. Verses 3 through 4, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and his earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light, rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. This is obviously going back to God on Mount Sinai. Paran and Teman were obviously believed to be in the land of Edom, which they also believe is where Mount Sinai was at that time. I liked the way he started this, because obviously we know it happened at Sinai. We know that the law was delivered to the people, the Ten Commandments. Certainly a seminal moment in the history of God with his people. And we know why we're here, actually. We know why God is having to say these things to Habakkuk. It's because they've violated the laws. They've forgotten the law. They've forgotten their history, so to speak. And so I think that's why he starts off this way. I think it's a possible reason he started off this way was, God, you gave us this perfect law. You gave us, you were faithful to us in giving us this law. You kept your promises to us, and now we've violated that. But I'm going to remember you as being the God on the mountain who had to veil his power in order for us to even be able to witness a sliver of that. I'm going to remember you as the God who gave us everything we needed to serve you, and yet we still violated those principles. And then in verse 5, before him went pestilence and plague followed at his heels. I think obviously this is in relationship to the 10 plagues, obviously, that were inflicted on Egypt as a result of being enslaved. I think it could, in more general terms, it could just be the idea that Habakkuk is declaring that you have power over every event. Obviously, we've talked about that. We talked about that in other classes. God has power over every small event, every large event. We dealt with a plague of sorts several years ago. God had his hand in that, and I think we can trust in that and know that for sure. And Habakkuk seems to know that as well. I kind of thought about the origin of Israel in Egypt. I know it doesn't necessarily say famine, but obviously we know that part of the reason they were in Egypt was because of a famine. I believe I'm remembering that correctly. And that's why they were eventually subjected to slavery by Pharaoh. Obviously, it was a part of God's greater plan, but God has a specific notion for what every event needs to accomplish and for what he's going to do with every event that happens. Verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations, and the eternal mountains were scattered. His everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I think this could mean a couple of things. The Deuteronomy passage talks about, we can actually go ahead and I'll read that for us. Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided the mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For the Lord's portion is people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Just this idea that God has ordained the people to occupy this land, the promised land. He divided it up as he saw fit. He gave each tribe their portion. He was deliberate. But also, again, in broad terms, God has power over creation. He created everything that we see around us. His power goes forth from the things that we see around us and the things that we've seen. Verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. I think this is directly relating to two stories. Obviously, the stories of Othniel, who the Israelites were taken into captivity by Cushan for idolatry, unbelief, common theme. And after they cried out to God, Othniel was raised up and he delivered them. And then Gideon, which is an amazing story, after the total number of troops were reduced down to 300 people, God gave them victory over Midian. And then verse 8, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? I think this is talking about two specific events in the history of Israel. One obviously being crossing of the Red Sea, and the other being the crossing of the Jordan, two major bodies of water that God gave them safe passage to cross over. And I like that. I like that it would probably be talking about the Red Sea specifically, just because if you remember that story, you obviously remember that the waters were parted and they were crossing over, and then as the Egyptians were sort of amassing around and crossing, their chariots and everything that they had with them were destroyed by the water. I can't help but think maybe Habakkuk was thinking about the military might of Babylon here, maybe. We talked last time how in the Psalms, in Psalms 20, it talks about not trusting in horses and chariots, but trusting in God. I think Habakkuk is relaying to God his remembrance of an event in which the people trusted in God, whereas the Egyptians trusted in their chariots, and God saw them through that. And in verse 9, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hand on high. I couldn't necessarily find a direct event that this would be relating to. Homer Haley, in his commentary on this section, seems to be indicating that he thinks this would be a relation, referencing the reality that using your own sheaths or using your own bows would be the sort of the inner politics of these nations who work together to occupy and take over, and then they turn on each other. So God having his hand in these internal conflicts and battles that eventually led to the demise of these nations. And it could just also mean, again, relaying the power of God. In verse 10 in particular, the mountains saw you and writhed, the raging waters swept on, the deep gave forth its voice. I think about Genesis 2, where it talks about the rivers near Eden, the rivers that we still see today. I mean, the fact that God raises up rivers, he is powerful to do that. He has that. I don't know, I think that could also be what it was talking about here. Verse 11, I apologize, I'll try to move fast so we can cover the last bit too. It's the most important part, I feel like. Verse 11, I believe, is talking about the events at the Valley of Ajalon. You'll recall that basically God allowed the sun to stay up so that they could have success over the Amorites and give them victory. You marched through the fury, verse 12, you marched through the earth in fury, you threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the head of his warriors. You came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. Again, I think this is just, again, trying to offer praise to God for the sweeping victories provided to God's people throughout their history, as a way to acknowledge that God has been with the people and God will continue to be with the people. I think if we were to take anything from verses 3 through 15, I think it would be that we are called to be people who are good about remembering God, are good about remembering the specific things that God has done for us. If you go back to Genesis 16, verse 13, you see the story of Hagar, and she's promised a son, Ishmael, and she runs away from Sarah, fearing her retribution. And God asks her, like, what are you doing? And she says, and he promises her these things, and she declares that he is the God that sees me. I think the God that sees us deserves to be seen by us. And I think this is exactly what Habakkuk is doing here. He's saying, God, I've seen you act. I've seen you behave towards us in a loving and merciful way that we've departed from you. I've seen you throughout history. I've seen you do these specific things that I can call out by name, that I can remember. And I want you to know that I appreciate it. I want you to know that I love you for it. And I want you to know that I'm sorry that we are defying you, that we are abandoning you, even though you've done these things for us. God deserves that level of devotion, admiration. And as sort of a practical aside, making this a part of our prayer life, a part of our day-to-day life would be, I think, a remarkable way to display our faith. Being a part of things like prayer groups and stuff like that, I think you can see that. If you go back through and you look at all the things and I have it in my phone, all of our prayer meetings, you can go through and check off things that have been answered, be it positive or negative in our minds, but things that have been answered, God's answer to all of our prayers. You can see that and know that God is acting, and I think that's a remarkable thing. I think it just takes us having open eyes, having a heart and a willingness to learn and listen and see and appreciate him for that. So verses 16 through 19. I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, my leg trembles beneath me. Yet I'll quietly wait for the day of the trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive oil fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the name of the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. So as sort of an end to this prayer, Habakkuk says, I still am fearful of the future, although I have a confidence that something good will come from this, and God will make that happen, whatever it looks like. And again, we've talked about how we don't know what happens to Habakkuk, but I remember in Hebrews 11, where it talks about the prophets as being examples of faith as well. So I think Habakkuk is certainly amongst those people being named. What he's saying here is he knows that there's destruction coming, and he knows it's going to be bad, and there's going to be a loss of life, loss of property, loss of everything that we anchor ourselves to. In spite of that, he's going to find joy in places that we don't typically find joy in, or he's going to find joy in what we should be finding joy in. I like this quote from Matthew Henry. Joy in God is never out of season, nay, it's in a special manner seasonable when we are met with losses and crosses in the world, that it may then appear that our hearts are not set upon these things, nor our happiness bound up in them. And I think that's a truth that we all ought to live by. It's a certainty that we're going to meet with trials and tribulations that challenge our faith, things that are tough to deal with, things that make us feel hemmed in, as Habakkuk felt hemmed in. But there's no other place to find your trust and your faith than God. These things we read about in chapter 3, this is our history too. I think we can forget that. These are the things that we anchor our faith in, the truths that we read about God and the things that he's done for us and the promises he's made to us. And that's why Habakkuk takes joy, and we should all take joy too. I wanted to offer you something I thought would be cool if we had time. I think we've lost time, unfortunately, but I thought about what a prayer for Twin City would look like. We were kind of Habakkuk. These are just things I thought about since I've been here. I've been here 9 years since, it'll be 9 years in June. We've had a lot of things happen at Twin City, but God's been there with us throughout it all, which is amazing. We've had a lot of growth here, tremendous amount of growth, so much that we're building a new building. We have new evangelists, 2 men who are devoted to their work and are certainly great at it. We've had a lot of births, had deaths. We've had deaths of unborn children. We've had, like I said, new membership, things of that nature. We've had people that we've grown close to move on to other places. We have opportunities to give our support, both financial and spiritual, to men in other places who are doing good work. We've survived a lot of political turmoil and a lot of global turmoil, COVID, all those elections that we see. We've seen new lives come to God. We've seen people come back to God. We've seen people declare their devotion and desire to recommit themselves. I feel like we all have unity in what we're doing here. I feel you can feel that when you come in this building. We have elders and deacons who are devoted each and every day to the service of everyone in this congregation, and you feel that and you know that. You can talk to these people and you can feel the excitement. And finally, I think we have harmony with other people, other churches, other groups of people. And this is not our own doing. This is God. And we should praise God for that.